Now then everyone, this is the Wedding Mavericks podcast, a podcast for wedding photographers and videographers who want to build successful and sustainable businesses. My name is Jules, and on this episode we are discussing movement and motion in your photos and films. So, whether you are a regular listener or you're new to the podcast, we really appreciate you spending your time with us as we discuss the important topics, issues and news related to the wedding photography and filmmaking industry. So, how y'all doing, guys? It's just me today. Lindsay's not with me. We obviously on the last podcast we discussed the topic of mid-wedding season stress, which hopefully was something that was relatable, helped you feel like you weren't alone if things have been a bit challenging at this time of year. And we alluded to the fact that we have quite busy personal lives with kids and stuff that's going on. So it's another one of those weeks where we really tried to get some time to record the podcast together, and it just doesn't come together. And because I know that we're getting more and more listeners every week, and we really enjoy putting these out, and we've got them all kind of planned and mapped out, ready to record, and we just haven't quite got that rhythm with the recording. So I've decided to record it myself. When you listen to this, if you listen to this on the day that it comes out, we'll be driving down to the other end of the country, the very southern part of the country for a wedding, which is sort of going to be a 5-6, maybe more hour journey. So we're kind of, I just had to get this recorded, and that's the situation. So hopefully it won't be too boring or monotonous with just me. The topic we're going to be talking about is probably something that I'm a little bit, it's a little bit more my forte anyway. It wouldn't be, it's more of a technical filmmaking, academic, not academic, but I did a degree in film and photography, and I'm a bit of a geek when it comes to all this stuff. Lindsay's more into the people and the emotions, as we both are, but that's kind of our that's our vibe. But I'm certainly more the geek when it comes to all the technical and equipment stuff. So we'll get straight into it. The reason I wanted to talk about this is because prior to the last episode, we were discussing topics that were related to actual shooting. So whether it was photography, whether it was videography, filmmaking, we were covering topics that were pertinent to the actual shooting aspects. And then obviously we've had a little break, and last episode we were talking about things that were more business related / to do with general, how you feeling type stuff, and getting through what is sometimes quite a difficult, lonely, challenging job, running your own business in particular. So this is moving back more towards the topics we were covering before, which were towards the shooting thing. So we talked about lighting, and we talked about composition, and we talked about how you can use different lenses and shot types and things. And the next one that was on the list, the one that was planned as the next episode, if we hadn't have ended up having that summer break, was going to be to do with shot movement. So why is this an important topic to cover? Well, it is more pertinent to videography and filmmaking. There's no getting around that. But it is relevant for photographers too. And that's the bit that I'm going to start with, because I think that applies to photographers too. It applies to both. The second half of the podcast will be more to do with making moving images, films. But it's still, I think if you're a photographer, at some point you might get into videography. You might be a photographer who's starting to get into videography too. So this is definitely a topic that will be of use, it will be of interest. Because whether you actually intend to put any movement in your film or your photos, you should know about it. Because maybe it's the thing that makes you keep things very stable and still, static. you might decide that's actually the route you want to go down, and I will refer to that quite a lot during this conversation. So, it's relevant to everybody, even if you don't like using movement, because you need to know why you might not. So, let's start with the difference between motion and movement. And again, this is all my kind of opinion and interpretation of a topic that is, I've kind of figured this out myself, as well as getting formally educated in it. I've figured this out myself. So let's start with motion. Motion is similar for both photography and filmmaking, because I would say that motion is there because it takes place in the frame. So there are things moving, and we want to provide the context for that movement, as in, like, the people, the objects, whatever it is that's happening in your frame, whether you're taking a still image or a moving image, the things in there are moving. Okay, that's what I think motion is. So whether we are taking, whether we're doing a still image or a moving image, we're going to use different techniques to capture and interpret that motion. So that motion might be something that we want to completely eradicate. We might want to freeze everything in that image. Obviously, for a photo, we're going to be freezing it, but we might want to show no motion. We might want to slow that motion down. We might want to show that there's a lot of motion. And so it's about understanding those techniques so that we can do that. And yeah, this is obviously based on people that have got a less extensive understanding of this, because honestly, I've been to film school, I've been to photography school. They didn't teach you it like I'm going to try and explain it now. They just, it's all very wishy-washy. There's more to do with looking at more broad topics, but the specifics of how you do something, they don't teach you. It's hard to find a YouTube video that actually explains it in simple terms. So here we go. How are we going to deal with motion in photography or filmmaking? First thing, showing the speed. Showing the speed of motion blur or freezing something is going to evoke whatever feeling you want from that image. And it's the same whether it's still or moving. So if you want to show that stuff was moving in an image, you're going to want a little bit of motion blur there. If you don't want to show it, you're going to freeze it, and you're going to put your shutter speed up to freeze it. You're going to lower your shutter speed to show motion. That is, the simple. If you've been doing this a while, if you've studied any kind of photography, filmmaking stuff, you're going to understand that. And it's basically, you need to know when to use that to get the right context. So what we're looking for is an understanding of, what water should look like, for instance. That's like a very simple one that they would teach you if you did a basic kind of photography course, is freezing water or showing that water's flowing. The shutter speed, if you went now and you turned the tap on and filmed it, or put your camera in front of it and took some photos of it at different shutter speeds, you would see different results. And you would see like the water was either these really tight droplets that seemed to be like frozen and didn't look they might look pretty impressive, but they wouldn't look real. Or you would see this like more constant flow of water. And then that's why people take long exposures for waterfalls and water moving and things like that. And you can do the same thing with video. If you want to show people, if you want to show some sort of like weird scene of to show disorientation and kind of a weird movement. For example, let's say a dance floor where you think of a film where they might be like taking drugs and stuff, and you want the kind of feeling to be like, whoa, it's all a bit spaced out. you'd lower your shutter speed, and then everything would look really freaky. And I've done this before in weddings because I've thought, oh well, I'll mix a little bit in of some really like slow shutter speed into the video to give the feeling of like a really crazy dance floor. So that's what I'm going to keep doing, is trying to tie this stuff into a wedding. So that's what you might do. Okay, the next bit, frame rate. Now, again, it's not about teaching people to suck eggs, but when it comes to photography, your frame rate is important, because if you want to capture a moment, you might up the frame rate so that you're taking lots of photos per second. So you put it on like a burst mode. That is going to help you capture motion, because you're going to want to pick moments out of something that's happening fast. With filmmaking, you might want to slow the frame down. You might want to use slow motion for a reason. That's how we might show some motion, but we might manipulate it to create a different feeling. So a normal speed is just going to be like, as it happened, it's going to feel realistic. Slowing it down is going to really make the viewer get into that moment. So whatever you decide, people can argue about overusing slow motion and things, but using high frame rate and slowing it down and having that really nice looking slow footage is very useful in weddings, because a lot of it is about love and particular moments that people are going to want to savor, and by slowing it down, it allows them to do that. And so that's a way of using the frame rate to capture emotion and motion. So to some degree, your lens choice can come into this. And you might say, how does motion in a shot, how does your lens choice come into that? And that's because you might be showing a particular situation and you're using depth of field, and you're using like the focal, the amount of stuff that's in focus. You might be using that as part of the motion. So if something's coming towards and it comes from out of focus into focus, or vice versa, that's helping to create an emotion, create a feeling around motion. And if you're using a high f-stop, you're closing the aperture down and you've got a larger depth of field, that's going to feel very different to if you've got a shallower depth of field and you're allowing things to come in and out of focus within the frame. The motion that's happening, people moving around, is coming in and out of focus. So that's a way of showing motion, technically, using your lenses. Next one linked to that is composition. So considering the direction of travel. Is something moving through the frame? Is it moving towards the camera, away from the camera? Is it moving from the left to the right of the frame? Where are you going to compose those elements? So if something's moving from the left to the right of the frame, I would say that you start with composing it on that side, and then you're showing them, like let's say it's a person, you're showing them walking that way. You're showing them walking across the frame. So you start with the left hand of the frame, you start where the person is, and you leave space for them to walk to the right hand side. That might be your choice, because this is in a photo as well, by the way. I'm talking mainly about photo there. So you're going to show them walking, and that is a method of composition. And you're basically showing room for the objects to move in the frame. And it's that's just one example, but you could use that in all sorts of different ways. And then the last one is movement of the camera. And if we will be talking more about this in relation to video in the next section. But if we just cover it for photo, let's say you've got a dance floor, and the photos where you see the light trails and there seems like there's like this blur and this energy on the dance floor. Well, that is all to do with dragging the shutter So a slightly lower shutter speed than you would take normally, but also moving the camera, whether it's zooming the lens in and out, whether it's whipping it round, whether it's moving it from side to side. You're moving the camera to show more movement in that image, in that still image, and to create that kind of emotion. And that's really useful for, that feeling of energy, that feeling of it's a bit of a chaotic dance floor. And it also looks really cool with the light trails and stuff. So that is talking about motion. Motion in the image, how you might practically use your camera, and why you might practically use a camera, because it should always be for a reason. It shouldn't be because, well, I'm just going to try this shit out and it looks cool. It should be that you're doing it because there's a reason to do it. It's going to make the person who looks at that photo or watches that video, it's going to make them feel something. And it's going to make them think, yeah, that's cool, but also I feel like that was the appropriate thing at that time. That makes me feel more part of the image, makes me relate to it more. Right. I hope that made sense and that wasn't just a load of waffle. Now we're going to talk more specifically about camera movement. And this is definitely, like I said, more specific to filmmaking and videography, because in photography, the only reason really to move the camera mid-shot is some of the examples I gave earlier. But in video, in filmmaking, camera movement is almost a character in itself. In filmmaking, it's part of everything. It isn't really a part of photography in an integral way, but it's so important to filmmaking, because whether you choose to hold the camera completely still, whether you choose to have the handheld feel, the really smooth, glidey feel, whether you move it fast, you move it slow, up, down, left, right, in different directions, with different motions to it, whether you move the camera in those ways, it's all for a reason. It's all part of creating the feeling that the viewer's going to have. So let's start with, do we actually need movement? The answer to that question is no. If you've been doing wedding videography for a while, or you look at a lot of really good wedding filmmakers, you'll see so many static shots. One of the kind of one of the big things is watching people who have just started this or don't really get it, and it will be a case of they'll move in the camera all the time. I see plenty of wedding films where the camera's moving side to side, up and down, really gradually in every shot. And I think it's because what you think at that point in your videography filmmaking career is that by moving the camera around, by having that motion, that somehow makes it cinematic. And honestly, it doesn't. I'm just gonna say it doesn't make it cinematic at all. And then there are the ones where there's like excessive camera shake, and they feel like the person with the camera was unintentionally just moving the camera around because they didn't have anything to hold it steady, and they didn't really know how to have a static camera. They were hand holding it, or they had it on some crappy tripod that didn't hold it still. They just haven't worked out that there's certain shots that want to be still, certain shots that want to move, but it's about being intentional. And you can have that handheld camera feel, but if the camera's just like shaking around and there's these micro jitters in it, it's definitely not a good feeling for the viewer, unless we're talking about something where that's going to add to the emotion, which would be like a high action or some kind of like horror film or something, which most weddings aren't going to be like that. So It's about knowing why we are moving the camera rather than just doing it or doing it unintentionally. So I would say that one of the biggest pieces of advice for newer wedding videographers, and I know that this podcast is going to be more popular amongst newer wedding videographers who want to learn, is to keep the camera still. Like, we've all been there. I've made these mistakes. I thought I needed to get the camera on a slider and on a fluid head tripod and move it up and down and left, right, side to side. Get that cinematic movement in there. And it turns out actually that's not really what works. It doesn't. It might look like it's quite cool, but it actually doesn't help with storytelling. It doesn't help with creating the right emotion that you want. If you're doing it on every shot, it ends up feeling a little bit like someone's on a boat, getting seasick. And particularly, I'm going to talk about this in relation to long form stuff. So imagine your ceremony speeches, things like that. The best thing you can possibly do is put your camera on a tripod for ceremony speeches, get the right shot, and then try not to move it once. Now, that's really difficult at weddings because they're live events, but believe me, if you can get to a point where you can anticipate where you can leave a camera so that everything just happens in front of the frame that you've set, you are winning. And part of the reason is because that's usually how you're going to get the right stuff. But it's also because it helps you have an efficient workflow. It helps you with your editing. If you're set up for your ceremony and speeches and you're constantly reframing, you're constantly moving the camera, believe me, it just takes you longer to edit because you're constantly switching between cameras. You're constantly moving the camera, and therefore you're having to edit all those movements out. Whereas if you just get 2 or however many cameras you use, and you set them up, and you're like, these fuckers are not moving, I promise you now, your editing will speed up. So there you go. There's a little tip, if you like, for you. So let's move on to, we've obviously talked about why you shouldn't move your camera. Let's talk about why you might move your camera. So we use movement because it's there, right? Because the characters, the objects are moving. Whether that's walking, or driving, or climbing, or falling. Obviously, I'm hopefully not climbing and falling at weddings. But we're doing it because objects or people within the frame, this is general filmmaking stuff, we're using movement in our camera because we are moving with the action. That's one reason to do it. The other reason is motivated movement. And motivated movement is basically us trying to influence the viewer to intentionally feel something based on the action on the screen. So it's almost like a direct response. So something happens on the screen and the direct response is us moving the camera to make them feel something, feel a reaction to what's just happened. So imagine it a bit like a visual narration, following or moving the action. So instead of talking, instead of like someone explaining what's happening on screen, the camera is explaining what's happening on screen by moving around. Now, how does that tie into a wedding? Well, weddings, they're moving around, aren't they? We go from character to character. We go from location to location. There are things that happen in the day where people move from part of they move from part of the room to the other part of the room. They dance. They interact with each other. So movement within, motivated movement is actually quite a straightforward thing to integrate into your wedding films because there is that kind of action all the time. So it isn't just about the actual camera movement. It's going to be influenced by composition and the camera and subjects interacting within the scene. So think about the foreground and the background. Think about shooting through things. Think about blocking parts of the shot and then revealing them. And that's a reason to use camera movement. Think about characters moving in and out of the scenes at the key times. An obvious sort of a thing is where the character. I'm calling them characters because it's a filmmaking technique, filmmaking terminology. But let's say the couple are moving towards you, moving away from you, moving through the scene. You might use certain techniques to show that and enhance that. So we're trying to show specific elements of the action at different points to create some context. It could be to create some tension. It could be to create some kind of relief. So tension and relief for the viewer. They could be like, it's all happening, or is it going to happen? And obviously we know what's going to happen at most weddings, but it's still that's kind of part of the storytelling. It's not just about using words. It's not just about taking what they said in the vows or speeches and overlaying it over the film. It is also a massive part about how you compose an image, how you use lighting, and then how you move the camera. I've mentioned that this is heavily tied into other topics, lens type, shot type, composition. So if you're interested in those topics as well, because they tie into this, check out episode 39 and 40 of the podcast, just a few before this. They're going to help you sort of understand some of the context that I'm talking about there. Right. So shot movement, we could have slow movement, we could have fast movement, we could have stable, nice smooth movement, we could have shaky movement. The duration of the movement, so is it, are they short and quick movements or are they long sweeping ones? And, the length of the shot, the length of the movement in the shot, that could be quite important to how that shot ends up feeling. If you've got quick movements all over the place, that's going to feel very different to a really slow, long reveal shot. So you need to have that reason. It's part of the storytelling. You're evoking emotion for the viewer. Imagine, energy versus energy and an uneasy feeling versus like an ominous and like a really kind of slow emotional moment. And you want to match that style that you've got with the film, match the style of your way of making films with the way that you're using this camera movement. So here we go. We're going to talk about the specific types of camera movement that you can use. So the first one is the pan. So this is a side-to-side movement. Imagine, just literally the camera is pointing and it moves from left to right or right to left on its y-axis. I had to think about that for a second. So this is basically, if you're on a tripod, you're just moving it round. And you might be following something moving from one side of the frame to the other. And that is probably the most simple type of movement there is. And it probably doesn't get used that much these days in modern wedding filmmaking because people aren't on tripods all the time. But they were sort of 10, 20 years ago. They definitely were. You might want to use this. If you're doing some establishing shots, you might want to create like a more panoramic feeling to kind of the establishing shot. You might want to show the importance of people walking from one place to another, tracking them, following them, but not, following them, just showing them moving. The next one would be a tilt. So this is like the same as the pan, but it's just on the opposite axis. It's on the x-axis. I think I've got that right, X and Y. I'm not even sure if I've got that right, but I'm not about to start researching it now. Tilt is just up and down. So it's the same thing. Imagine it's on a tripod with a fluid head and you're just moving it up and down. And you might do that to reveal certain things in the scene. You might do it to just put a little bit of motion in something, so that it kind of creates that little bit of extra. To be honest, these motions are the ones that are a bit outdated and a bit cheesy. Now, how you can enhance these a little bit, and this is if you look at some of the higher energy, more kind of alternative style wedding filmmaking, and what I'm going to say about that is, I don't know what the listeners are like, right? I don't talk to you all. I've not met you all. We're all going to have our own individual tastes. What I'll say is, I have mixed taste. So I like doing slow cinematic stuff, and I like doing high energy stuff. And if you actually looked through all our films, you would see that we've done everything in between. So for me, I don't have a particular, this is my style, this is what I do. I like to do it all. But some people won't like that high energy stuff. But I can really appreciate it. And if you're kind of looking at the high energy stuff, the way that you might use transitions, the way you might use movement in your camera to create those transitions would be using whip pans and whip tilts in order to move from one shot to the next and do it in a really cool high energy way. So that's a way that you can, more modern and more, contemporary way of doing pans and tilts. So the next one would be zoom. So this could be a push-in, but the difference between this and the next one we'll talk about is that zooms are more like a static push-in. So the camera's not actually kind of moving physically. We are using the lens, or we're using post-production to zoom into the shot. It feels very different to when the camera is physically moving in and out. And there are reasons that you would do this, and it might be because you want to emphasize something, and it might be because you want a particular, there's something in the frame that needs more attention, and you want to recompose. So there'd be a good reason there to zoom into something. Imagine an object like some rings or something, and you just want to have that really slow kind of push into it. You might use a post-production zoom. And obviously back in the day, they used to use zoom all the time because you just didn't move the camera. The average filmmaker wouldn't move the camera. You'd need a massive Steadicam and a really highly trained operator to move a camera physically, or you'd need a jib or a crane or something like that. Whereas it's different now, so zooms aren't really as popular. But back in the day, a zoom into somebody would have been popular because that was the only way you could get closer to somebody mid-shot. The next one would be like a dolly move, in or out. And whether you realise it or not, this is basically what you're doing all the time if you use a gimbal or a drone or something like that. Because essentially what a dolly is moving the camera physically towards something or away from something. And it used to be that the only real way to do that stably would be by using a track. So, and they still do this today. They build tracks, and they have this massive camera kind of trolley that sits on the track, and a big camera on it, and they have an operator on it. Someone actually pushes that trolley in and out, and that's how they get those really smooth motions within films. But these days, we've got things like sliders, we've got things like gimbals, we've got a Steadicam, we've got drones, and these can replicate those kind of movements, and we use these all the time to reveal or introduce something. Maybe it's like an establishing shot, a location, maybe it's a character or an object. maybe it's like the scene. We move into the scene rather than just being in the scene already. And again, that's a stylistic thing, but these are ways that it can be used. And it's great when you're using it in accompaniment with like foreground and background elements within a shot, because you move past those elements, and it feels very different, does this move, in a way that a zoom or some other kind of movement would feel. A great example of this is a confetti shot. So you're a videographer and you are doing the confetti shot, and you stood next to the photographer, and the photographer wants to track back. So imagine, whether you're going handheld, whether you're doing some crazy on top of a monopod, trying to keep it still, whether you've got Steadicam or if you've got a gimbal, what you're essentially doing is a dolly move. It's a dolly move. You're just walking back with the camera. So the camera is now revealing things as it moves back, but it's also tracking away from the subject. And the distance that you get to or from the subject is going to feel completely different to if it was static, or if you were using some kind of zoom with the lens or in post-production. So it's I would say, out of all of the types of movement that we use within wedding films, other than the simple tilt and pans that's a bit outdated, the dolly moves are actually the most used move that we have, all of us. The next one, truck. This is basically, rather than moving it on a fixed point, where like a tilt or a pan, it's basically a dolly move where the camera's physically moving. It's not on a fixed point. It's not just tilting, and it's not just panning. It's actually moving up straight, and it's moving down straight, or it's moving left straight, it's moving right straight. Again, this is the sort of thing we're talking about with sliders, gimbals, drones. This is what we're doing. So a truck is, truck and dolly is basically the movements that we're using. The next one, tracking and follow. So subject, this is basically using a dolly style move, but this is where things like your gimbals and your drones and things like that, they really come into it, because it's more like that point of view following something in the scene. So it could be like your portrait sessions and things like that. Imagine your portrait session and you've got your gimbal out, or you're going handheld and you're doing a bit of a motion and you're following the subject walking through the grass, or walking towards the camera, but you don't want the camera to stay static, so you're moving back. And we're kind of doing this all the time. Some people might follow a couple into a room as they walk in and make their entrance. Always a dodgy idea, unless the photographer's cool with it, because you're likely to get in a photographer's shot. But, that's something, I've been there. I've done that. I learned not to do it because I thought that's a bit harsh afterwards, but early days. And what that's doing is it's properly immersing the viewer in the action. If you want to feel like you were really there, that's how we do it. We sort of like follow the subject, like we're following them through their wedding. You're not going to be able to do it all day. But for the odd shot, it can actually look really cool. And if you think about different things that you could film feet, film the top, film like a wider shot of them walking, it can really, especially if you're like walking past those other elements in the shot, so you're getting to feel that movement, that can really feel pretty cool. Couple more then. So a parallax, that's a really kind of multiple axis motion, if you like, moving up and round at the same time. So like two axes, if you like, at the same time to kind of go round. This might be you might circle the couple. You might like circle round the couple that are standing there on the dance floor or something like that. But you might also take it from down low and go up higher, and there you're going to be doing this parallax. And I've just given you the example there of like on the dance floor, that might be pretty cool. it ain't going to be cool much of the day. It depends on your style. But it ain't going to be cool much of the day. But there's something you can do. Or what about a camera roll? Literally rolling the camera over on it. I don't even know what axis you'd actually call that. That sounds stupid now, but just rolling the camera so that it does like a 360. You can do that on a gimbal. Most gimbals allow you to do that. You could do it handheld to some extent. You could do it as kind of a transition if you like that high energy style. And these are extra kind of motions that you wouldn't necessarily use in many wedding films, but they might be something that you call on from time to time. And then we're kind of coming to the end of it a little bit now. We're going to talk about handheld. So handheld is, well, you tell me, is handheld moving or is handheld static? Because what I'd say is, more recently, we have 100% moved towards handheld being the favourite thing. We'll use a gimbal for very limited parts of the day. We'll have the camera on a tripod or a monopod for the ceremony speeches, anything that's long form, anything where we're going to have to hold our hands still for all that time. But realistically, 70% of the day, or certainly all of the day pretty much, that isn't involving a ceremony or speeches, we're handheld. And I know that this is now become the most popular thing. Lots more people are doing this now. And it's because obviously the cameras have got better, the in-body and lens stabilization has got better, and the post-production and artificial intelligence style stabilization's got better. So it means that we can hold the camera, if you try holding a camera with none of those things really steady, it'll look absolutely shit. But because technology's improved, we can now hold them still without it looking ridiculous. And obviously, some people are better at it than others. It takes a bit of practice. But when you get good at it, it actually frees you up. It allows you to look at what is happening and capture the things that are happening. It makes you a better event filmmaker, because that's the thing, you're reacting with events. You're not always able to sort of plan out and go, I'm going to stand here, I'm going to stand there. You've got to react. And part of that reaction is being able to move quick, being able to just record stuff. And if you're worrying about moving tripods, monopods, moving a gimbal, anything else that you might be using, it's going to slow you down. And so handheld is definitely now the way. But because we're holding it by hand, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be moving it. Like, I would say, 90% of the shots that we will get handheld are completely static. There's no intended motion in them whatsoever. And if there's movement in them, if it doesn't fit, I'm going to try and get rid of it. And I'm going to try and get rid of it by either slowing the footage down, by using post-production stabilization. And, that's it. It's become a thing that we can do that 5 years ago you couldn't do. And it's like frees you up. It means you don't actually have to think about this too much anymore. You don't need to think about what tool you're using and how you're going to get the shot. It means that you can actually focus on what is happening. It means you can behave more like a photographer. That's how I would interpret it. People now, we do both photo and video, but when we're just doing video, even the photographer at most weddings, even though I'm really cool and I don't give them any shit, and I am not that guy. I am really easy to work with and helpful. But even the photographer, when they first see me, will have the nose put out of joint because I look like them. I don't have any equipment other than a strap and a camera. And once they realise it's cool, but that's the reality. We can now film a wedding just like a photographer can take photos at a wedding, and apart from obviously ceremony speeches and stuff. So I think that's amazing, because we're just focusing on the story. We're just focusing on the people then. We're not trying to worry all the time about lugging bits of equipment round. So that's it, really. I hope that what I've talked about has been useful, either because it puts some things into context or perspective, filled in some kind of gaps in understanding, or maybe just made you think a bit differently about how you move the camera, whether you need to move the camera. And a lot of the time you don't. And it's better that you don't. But as well, think about what you're trying to, what's the end product that you're trying to create. And if you focus on what the end product is, rather than the process of getting there, you can change the process, if that makes sense. You can make a better process for getting there. So I hope that has been somewhat useful or whatever. If it hasn't, let me know. I'm sorry that Lindsay wasn't here on this one. It's just been me, and I hope that my dulcet tones haven't bored you. But I've enjoyed talking about this because it's something that I'm really into. I absolutely love. I love photography and I love filmmaking. I love the technical side. I love the emotional and people side of it. And so that's why I get quite passionate talking about these things. Because I know that the way that they teach you certain things in film school, or if you learn photography from an academic perspective, those things don't always translate into doing weddings, because they're just different. We're not on a movie set. We're not in a photography studio. You have to do things differently at weddings. So let me know what you think. Best way is on Instagram @WeddingMavericks. Check out the YouTube channel. You can watch this on YouTube. It's going to look very different today because I've filmed it on my MacBook Pro instead of on proper cameras. This might be something, if it works all right, I might do it again, but I'm just trying it out. And I've got the website weddingmavericks.com. It's been great speaking to you. Hope you enjoy it, and tune in next time. Subscribe if you want to hear more episodes, and I'll catch you in the next one. See you later, guys.